Team and I have been closely monitoring the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and moving quickly to execute the plans we had put in place to respond to every constituency, including
Reacting to Joe Biden's speech on Afghanistan, by the way, live.
Collapse we're seeing now. I'll speak more in a moment about the specific steps we're taking, but I want to remind everyone how we got here and what America's interests are in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been.
Why did you stay there 10 years then?
And a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. These threats warrant our attention and our resources. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. If necessary, we'll do the same in Afghanistan. We've developed counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on the direct threats to the United States and the region.
Basically saying they only care about US, they don't care about the Afghan citizens.
When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021. Just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only a cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force of some 300,000 strong, incredibly well equipped, a force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air support. We gave them every chance to determine their own future. We could not provide them was the will to fight for that future.
Okay, so he's blaming the Afghanistan military.
Special forces units
I don't like. They do deserve some blame, though. I'm not gonna lie. They do deserve blame.
Is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now. There is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years, or 20 more years, the U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference.
We'll never know that now.
Here's what I believe to my core. It is wrong to order American troops to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not. The political leaders of Afghanistan were unable to come together for the good of their people, unable to negotiate for the future of their country when the chips were down. They would never have done so while U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, bearing the brunt of the fighting for them. And our true strategic competitors, China and Russia, would love nothing more than the United States to continue to funnel billions of dollars in resources and attention into stabilizing Afghanistan.
I mean, they're gonna go into Afghanistan and negotiate with the Taliban now, so they have power there.
President Ghani and Chairman Abdullah at the White House in June, and again when I spoke by phone to Ghani in July, we had very frank conversations. We talked about how Afghanistan should prepare to fight their civil wars after the U.S. military departed, to clean up the corruption in government so the government could function for the Afghan people. We talked extensively about the need for Afghan leaders to unite politically. They fail to do any of that. I also urged them to engage in diplomacy, to seek a political settlement with the Taliban. This advice was flatly refused. Mr. Ghani insisted the Afghan forces would fight, but obviously he was wrong. So I'm left again to ask of those who argue that we should stay, how many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war when Afghan troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Mistake of staying and fighting indefinitely in a conflict that is not in the national interest of the United States, of doubling down on a civil war in a foreign country, of attempting to remake a country through the endless military deployments of U.S. forces. Those are the mistakes we cannot continue to repeat because we have significant vital interest in the world that we cannot afford to ignore. I also want to acknowledge how painful this is to so many of us. The scenes we're seeing in Afghanistan, they're gut-wrenching, particularly for our veterans, our diplomats, humanitarian workers, for anyone who has spent time on the ground working to support the Afghan people, for those who have lost loved ones in Afghanistan, and for Americans who have fought and served in the country, serve our country in Afghanistan. This is deeply, deeply personal. It is for me as well. I've worked on these issues as long as anyone. I've been throughout Afghanistan during this war, while the war was going on, from Kabul to Kandahar to the Kunar Valley. I've traveled there on 4 different occasions. I met with the people. I've spoken to the leaders. I spent time with our troops. And I came to understand firsthand what was and was not possible in Afghanistan. So now we're focused on what is possible. We will continue to support the Afghan people. We will lead with our diplomacy, our international influence, and our humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy and engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, of women and girls.
Speaking out won't do shit.
All over the world.
They'll just do whatever.
I've been clear, the human rights must be the center of our foreign policy, not the periphery. But the way to do it is not through endless military deployments. It's with our diplomacy, our economic tools, and rallying the world to join us. Now, let me lay out the current mission in Afghanistan. I was asked to authorize, and I did, 6,000 U.S. troops to deploy to Afghanistan for the purpose of assisting in the departure of U.S. and allied civilian personnel from Afghanistan, and to evacuate our Afghan allies and vulnerable Afghans to safety outside of Afghanistan. Our troops are working to secure the airfield and to ensure continued operation of both the civilian and military flights. We're taking over air traffic control. We have safely shut down our embassy and transferred our diplomats. Our diplomatic presence is now consolidated at the airport as well. Over the coming days, we intend to transport out thousands of American citizens who've been living and working in Afghanistan. We'll also continue to support the safe departure of civilian personnel of our allies who are still serving in Afghanistan. Operation Allies Refugee, which I announced back in July, has already moved 2,000 Afghans who are eligible for special immigration visas and their families to the United States. In the coming days, the U.S. military will provide assistance to move more SIV-eligible Afghans and their families out of Afghanistan. We're also expanding refugee access to cover other vulnerable Afghans who worked for our embassy, U.S. non-governmental agencies, or U.S. non-governmental organizations, and Afghans who otherwise are at great risk in U.S. news agencies. I know there are concerns about why we did not begin evacuating Afghans civilians sooner. Part of the answer is some of the Afghans did not want to leave earlier, still hopeful for their country. And part of it because the Afghan government and its supporters discouraged us from organizing a mass exodus to avoid triggering, as they said, a crisis of confidence. American troops are performing this mission as professionally and as effectively as they always do, but it is not without risks. As we carry out this departure, we have made it clear to the Taliban, if they attack our personnel or disrupt our operation, the U.S. presence will be swift and the response will be swift and forceful. We will defend our people with devastating force if necessary. Our current military mission will be short in time, limited in scope, and focused in its objectives. Get our people and our allies as safely as quickly as possible. And once we have completed this mission, we will conclude our military withdrawal. We will end America's longest war after 20 long years of bloodshed. The events we're seeing now are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a stable, united, secure Afghanistan, as known in history as the graveyard of empires. What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago or 15 years in the future. You have to be honest. Our mission in Afghanistan is taking many missteps, made many missteps over the past 2 decades. I'm now the 4th American president to preside over war in Afghanistan. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference. Nor will I shrink from my share of responsibility for where we are today and how we must move forward from here. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me. I'm deeply saddened by the facts we now face, but I do not regret my decision to end America's warfighting in Afghanistan and maintain a laser focus on our counterterrorism missions there and other parts of the world. Our mission to degrade the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and kill Osama bin Laden was a success. Our decades-long effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan was not, and I wrote and believed it never could be. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war, taking casualties, suffering life-shattering injuries, leaving families broken by grief and loss. This is not in our national security interest. It is not what the American people want. It is not what our troops, who have sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades, deserve. I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end. While it's been hard and messy, and yes, far from perfect, I've honored that commitment. More importantly, I made a commitment to the brave men and women who serve this nation that I wasn't going to ask them to continue to risk their lives in a military action that should have ended long ago. Our leaders did that in Vietnam when I got here as a young man. I will not do it in Afghanistan. I know my decision will be criticized, but I would rather take all that criticism than pass this decision on to another president of the United States, yet another one, a 5th one. Because it's the right one, it's the right decision for our people, the right one for our brave service members who risk their lives serving our nation, and it's the right one for America. Thank you. May God protect our troops, our diplomats, and all brave Americans serving in harm's way.
Well, that's the end of that. Thoughts on the speech? It was a well-written speech. He spoke well. Biden was very eloquent, but my thoughts on Afghanistan is that we should have had a better exit plan. Like, I believe we should pull out of Afghanistan, of course. I mean, I think we can all agree that we should leave Afghanistan at some point. We have to leave it. And even, we can leave it now, but we have to have a better exit strategy than, well, deal with it. Like, the Afghan military just completely collapsed. They say that they trained and did all this and did all that, but how much did they really do? Okay, so let's just read the second article now. Kabul, Washington. The rout of Afghan forces as Taliban fighters take one provincial city after another provides a stark answer to anyone wondering about the success of 2 decades of US-led efforts to build a local army. Despite about $89 billion budgeted for training the Afghan army, it took Taliban little more than a month to brush it aside. Over the last few days, the insurgents have seized every major city in Afghanistan, from Kandahar in the south to Mazar-i-Sharif in the north, and Herat in the west, and Jalalabad in the east. They now stand almost at the gates of Kabul. When was this article put? 2 days ago. Sorry, well, 15th, so yesterday. Well, they are at Kabul now. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani praised the Afghan security and defense forces in a brief televised address on Saturday, saying that they had a strong spirit to defend their people and their country. But still, there has been a shock at the lack of resistance put up by many Afghan army units. Some abandoned their posts, and others reached agreements with the Taliban to stop fighting and hand over the weapons and equipment. In some instances, the US officials say, provincial governors asked security forces to surrender or escape, perhaps in order to avoid further bloodshed because they believed defeat was unavoidable. Where deals were not cut, Afghan forces still appear to have melted away. Once morale goes, it spreads very quickly, and that's at least partly to blame, said US official. American officers have long worried that rampant corruption, well documented in parts of Afghanistan's military and political leadership, would undermine the resolve of badly paid, ill-fed, and erratically supplied frontline soldiers, some of whom have been left months or even years on end in isolated outposts, where they could have been picked off by the Taliban. Over many years, hundreds of Afghan soldiers were killed each month. But the army fought on, without any of the airborne evacuation of casualties and expert surgical care standard in Western armies. As long as international backing was there, once that went, resolve evaporated. Would you give your life for leaders who don't pay you on time and are more interested in their own future, said a second US official, speaking on the condition of anonymity, asked. It is an analysis shared by some on the Taliban movement itself. One Taliban commander in the central province of Ghazni said that the government's forces collapse started as soon as the US forces started withdrawing, as they didn't have any ideology except fleecing the Americans. The only reason for this unexpected fall of provinces was our commitment and the withdrawal of the US troops. I mean, this is really, really bad. I don't know how else to say it. This is really, really bad. Like, I get that we should leave. I agree that we should leave. We definitely should leave Afghanistan at some point. But just leaving when we know that they're not going to be able to support themselves means, what's the point of the last 20 years? Like, I don't get it, at all. He says he's not willing to send any more people to die, that it's not in our national interest, that it's not about nation building, but you go on around nation building and other countries. I'm talking about Joe Biden, by the way. This is what he said. If you don't nation build, the Taliban is just going to conquer, and then the Al-Qaeda is probably, and since they're friends, Al-Qaeda is probably going to also get stronger. And who knows what the Taliban is going to do. And the idea that they're just going to stay in Afghanistan and not bother US at all, they're completely anti-US. I wouldn't be surprised if they started doing terrorist attacks now, since they're much stronger than they were before. It's crazy. I'm trying to pop out chat here. Guess I can't do it now. Realistic. The defeat highlights the failure of the United States to create a fighting force in the image of its own highly professional military, with the motivated, well-trained leadership, high-tech weaponry, and seamlessly logistical support. On paper, Afghan security forces numbered around 300,000 soldiers. In reality, the numbers were never that high. So Biden saying it was 300,000 is not true. Dependent on a small number of elite special forces units that were shunted from province to province as most cities fell to the Taliban, the already high rate of desertions in the regular army soared. As the government forces started to fall apart, hastily recruited local militias, loyal to prominent regional leaders such as Marshal Abdul Rashid Dostum in the northern province of Faryab or Ismail Khan in Herat, who also rushed in to fight. Western countries had long been wary of such militias, though more in line with the realities of traditional Afghan politics where personal, local, or ethnic ties outweigh loyalty to the state. They were also open to corruption, abuse, and ultimately proved no more effective than conventional forces. Dostum fled to Uzbekistan as the Taliban advanced, and Khan surrendered to the insurgents. But whether it was ever a realistic goal to create a Western-style army in one of the world's poorest countries was at the literacy rate of 40% and a social and political culture far from developed sense of nationhood underpinning the US military is an open question. The US Army trainers who worked with Afghan forces struggle to teach basic lessons of military organization that supplies, maintaining equipment, and ensuring units get proper support are key to battlefield success. Jonathan Schroden, an expert on the CNA Policy Institute, said that who served as an advisor to U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, and the U.S.-led international force in Afghanistan, said the Afghan army functioned as much as a jobs program as a fighting force because its the source of a paycheck in a country where paychecks are hard to come by. But the chronic failure of logistical, hardware, and manpower support to many units meant that even if they wanted to fight, they ran out of the ability to fight in relatively short order. Afghan forces have been forced repeatedly to give up after pleas for supplies and reinforcements went unanswered, either because of incompetence or the simple incapacity for the system to deliver. Even the elite special force units that have borne the brunt of the fighting that recent years have suffered. Last month, at least a dozen commandos were executed by Taliban fighters in the northern province of Faryab after running out of ammunition and being forced to surrender. Richard Armitage, the former U.S. diplomat who organized a flotilla of southern Vietnam Navy ships to carry some 30,000 refugees out of Saigon before it fell in April 1975, has watched as the threat of a similar disaster unfolds in Kabul. As a Deputy Secretary of State under the former President George W. Bush, when the United States invaded in 2001, he was deeply involved in Afghanistan diplomacy. He said the Afghan army collapse pointed to the wilder failures of 2 decades of international efforts. I hear people expressing frustration in the press that the Afghan army can't fight a long fight. I assure you the Afghan army has fought, can fight, and if it's got a trigger and something comes out of the barrel, they can use it. The question is the government worth fighting for? Pretty good question. Pretty good question. What We Got Wrong in Afghanistan by Mike Jason. Okay, but let's... So basically, it was a corrupt government that led to the failure because they treated their soldiers badly, they didn't pay them enough, didn't send them enough supplies. So the army had no motivation to fight. So they just said, well, we're going to run. Why should we fight? Why should we die and risk our lives for a country that's not even going to help us, right? I don't know. Why would they? He's a military officer, this Mike Jason guy. So I think personally that the US wasn't doing enough or doing the correct things in training the Afghan army, in my opinion. Right? Mike Jason is a retired 2019 as a US Army colonel. After 24 years on activity duty, he commanded combat units in Germany, Kosovo, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Watching the rapid deterioration of the security situation in Afghanistan, the Taliban have captured a third of the country's provincial capitals in the week since the US military pulled its troops out. It has evoked a feeling of déjà vu for me. In 2005, and as an advisor to an Iraqi infantry battalion conducting a counter-insurgency operations in and out of Baghdad, one of the most violent parts of Iraq during one of the most violent periods in that conflict. It was difficult to have any hope at the time. I returned to Iraq in 2009, this time in Mosul, where my unit advised and supported 2 Iraqi army divisions, 1 Iraqi federal police division, and thousands of local police officers. This time, I sensed more progress. Leaving in Iraq in 2010, I felt we had done a great job, turning a corner and building a capable and competent security force. A year later, I found myself in Mazar-e-Sharif, Afghanistan, recruiting and training Afghan police units and commandos. After 9 months there, I again rotated home, thinking we'd done some good. I would be proved wrong on both counts. In 2014, by then stationed at the Pentagon, I watched in dismay as the Iraqi divisions I had helped train collapsed in a matter of days when faced with the Islamic State. Today, as Taliban seizes terrains across Afghanistan, including in what was in my area of operations, I cannot help but stop and reflect on my role. What did my colleagues and I get wrong? Plenty. From the very beginning, nearly 2 decades ago, the American military effort to advise and mentor Iraqi and Afghan forces was treated like a pickup game. Informal, ad hoc, absent of strategy. We patched together small teams of soldiers, marines, sailors, and airmen, taught them some basic survival skills, and gave them an hour-long lesson in the local language before placing them with foreign units. We described them variously as MITTs, BITTs, SPTTs, AFPAC hands, OMLT, PRTs, VSO, AAB, SFAB, IAG, MNSTSI, SFATs. Each a new term or chapter in a book without a plot. In most cases, these men and women courageously made it up as they went along. We borrowed untrained personnel for mostly administrative assignments and largely had them focus on tactical tasks, reporting progress in colorful bubble charts. Social media and public affair documents were replete with images of rifle range, obstacle courses, room clearing, and lots and lots of meetings, many of which were themselves about meetings. Over chai. But from my tours in Iraq, through my time in Afghanistan, larger systemic problems were never truly addressed. We did not successfully build the Iraqi and Afghan forces as institutions. We failed to establish the necessary infrastructure that dealt effectively with military education, training, pay systems, career progression, personnel, accountability, all the things that make a professional security force. Rotating teams through tours of 6 months to a year, we could not resolve the vexing problems facing Iraq and Afghanistan's army and police. Endemic corruption, plummeting morale, rampant drug use, abysmal maintenance, and inept logistics. We got really good at preparing platoons and companies to conduct raids and operate checkpoints, but little worked behind them. It is telling today that the best forces in Afghanistan are the special forces, commandos, small teams that perform courageously and magnificently, but despite a supporting institution, not because of one. If those were the things we did poorly and insufficiently, there were other things we should not have done at all, namely train police. We generally accepted that our ultimate goal of combating insurgents or terrorists was to turn the fight over to domestic law enforcement. In other words, get to the point where the police could handle threats without fielding the army. Remember, in Iraq, I keep saying Iraq, 2006 was supposed to be the year of the police. It would be hilarious if not for the incredible cost of blood and treasure. The year was terrible and a deadly one for police across Iraq. But the United States does not have a national police force, so police training became a task largely that fell to the army. In Iraq, I oversaw thousands of police, and in Afghanistan, I led a task force that vetted, selected, and fielded nearly 3,000 local police while supporting the Afghan National Police with a warrant-based targeting of insurgents. I should make clear that I have zero law enforcement experience, nor does the most of the U.S. military. Aside from some National Guard or Reserve troops, we do have military police units, but they serve a unique operational role unlike any of the security forces we try to build up. We attempted to bridge this gap by hiring a handful of brave retired police officers and having them serve as technical advisors and trainers alongside the US Army troops. But even they could only focus on tactical tasks. They lacked the professional and personal experience to build national institutions and systems. We never had a chance to make policing work. The US military could not overcome our national and institutional lack of experience. Looking back, we also failed to properly institutionalize advising large-scale conventional forces until far too late. No one was encouraged to take on these duties either. To keep moving up, officers such as myself had to rotate through normal command assignments as well. The army tried to change the wording of promotion and selection board, but the bureaucracy resisted. When we finally formally created the Security Force Assistant Brigades in 2018, it was telling that none of the new outfit's first key leaders had ever cut their teeth on the advisor teams. Ooh, this is a big article, but we'll keep reading. Oh god, I lost. Okay. Over these past 20 years, there have been many failings. We checked the box when it comes to saying that we trained our partners, spun a rosy narrative of progress, and perhaps prioritized the safety and well-being of our troops over the mission of buttressing partner capacity. When our Afghan partners shot at us, killing our comrades in the new infamous green on blue incidents, we tightened up our security procedures but did not address the hard questions of why they were shooting at us in the first place. We didn't send the right people, prepare them well, or reward them afterwards. We rotated strangers on tours of up to a year and expecting to build relationships, then replace them. We were overly optimistic and largely made things up as we went along. We don't like oversight or tough questions from Washington, and no one really bothered to hold us accountable anyways. We had no capacity or experience with some of our tasks, and we stumbled. Yet these failings, egregious as they were, made it easy to focus on the armed forces as a scapegoat. In fact, the military, our allies, and Iraqi and Afghan partners were responding to a lack of coherent policy and strategy. We invaded Afghanistan with the righteous anger after 9/11, but then what? Why was the United States in Afghanistan for years afterward? What about our fraught relationship with Pakistan and its influence on Afghanistan? A coherent strategy to address these questions would have made my job easier on the ground. First and foremost, a clearly articulated end goal would have assured our Afghan partners and our allies from other nations, as well as our foes, of our determination. Instead of leaving the entire effort to the Department of Defense, a coordinated strategy with commensurate resources across the government could have produced better results in multiple Afghan institutions. Further, 20 years ago, a commitment to law enforcement might have been very attractive to our allies, many of whom who had their own national police force and a track record of clear success in performing such missions. Perhaps most crucial, a clear and forceful foreign policy regarding Pakistan, coupled with a commitment to supporting and employing a new Afghan army, would have provided much clarity and focus for our military. We didn't fight a 20-year war in Afghanistan. We fought 20 incoherent wars, 1 year at a time, without a sense of direction. The US military can and should be blamed for the collapse of security force in Afghanistan. I hold us responsible. The current collapse keeps me at night. In the military, the main effort gets the best resources and the best talent available. For more than 20 years, no matter what was reported when we read the headlines, efforts to build and train Large-scale conventional security forces in Afghanistan and Iraq have been aimless, ham-fisted acronym soup of trial and error, and that never became the true main effort, and we are to blame for that. But we are not the only ones responsible. Someday we will ask young men and women to do this again, to fight a war overseas, to partner with local forces, to train them and build them up. Before we do, we owe it to those young people to ask the tough questions of how and why we all failed. And remember, I'm going to reiterate this point. Mike Jason is retired in 2019. U.S. Army Colonel, 24 years on active duty. He commanded combat units in Germany, Kosovo, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Right? So, this is a very experienced U.S. war veteran telling that it was the U.S.'s fault for not doing this correctly. Like, they gave them all the equipment, but they didn't address the systemic problems that were causing Afghan soldiers to desert, to have low morale, to be like not having the right resources, to not being paid correctly. I mean, they didn't address that. So because they didn't address that, all this money meant nothing. It was just a complete failure. So why didn't they address that? So that's my question. Why didn't we address that? Why didn't we address the rampant corruption that was in Afghanistan? We supplied them with all that stuff, but it seemed like we didn't really focus on the systemic issues. Like this veteran guy said, Mike Jones. That was his name? Yeah, Mike Jones. Mike Jason, sorry. Mike Jason, not Mike Jones. Mike Jason. He said that, right? And a lot of veterans have come out, and I did this in a previous video on Afghanistan, talking about why the heck did we even, like, what was the point of being there now? So basically the US completely mishandled, and this happened in Iraq too, right? Same exact thing happened in Iraq. So you're telling me that this has not, that there's no problem with the US, that it's all the local government's fault, because Biden was basically shifting the blame onto the local governments. Right? He was basically shifting the blame, saying, oh, if Afghanistan's corrupt, could you do the same thing in Iraq? You know what I mean? Like, again, Vietnam was way before my time, so I don't know too much about it. But I know in Iraq, basically the similar thing happened, where they pulled out and then all of a sudden, again, ISIS crushed them. Right? The Islamic State crushed them. So, what's going wrong? What's going wrong is that the US is not focusing on the systemic issues that plague these countries. Instead, they're just arming them, and not fixing the thing. Now, Biden said that they funded them. Now, from the articles I've read, nobody's mentioned that that the U.S. government was directly paying these guys. And it's not like these guys wouldn't fight. It's just, why fight for a government that doesn't care? But US should have addressed these issues. Their tactics were very wrong. And Mike Jason, a war veteran, said this. So, you know what I mean? A guy who has served so many years. 24 years on active duty. He's been in Iraq, Kuwait, Afghanistan. Like, he's been all over. I think we should listen to people like this who say that, like, this isn't, you know, this isn't good. So, the US... We should pull out of Afghanistan. But what we should learn is that the reason the military is like this is that the US never addressed the systemic problems, the corruption, the incompetence that existed in Afghanistan. So this is what happens. The lesson we should learn is that if we want to help a country, we have to make sure we have to help the people, and we have to fix the government. Just supplying them arms and basic like food, water, shelter, it's not enough. We need to fix the government in the first place. And if you can't do that, don't go there in the first place. This achieved nothing. The Taliban's basically taken everything back. What have you achieved in these 20 years? Now all the people who, and Biden's talking about, oh, it's for the veterans, making sure that they don't go over there and die. Yeah, I agree. We shouldn't send people over there to die. But what about the ones who have died, who have come back with PTSD and other issues? What is this saying to them? Saying, oh, well, all the sacrifices means nothing now. Because you guys completely mishandled it. Completely mishandled the, what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. You have to analyze what went wrong and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But we're not doing that. We either have people on the left saying, oh, this is great, we should always pull out, and then we have, you know, which I think is crazy. Like, we had to, look, the situation was we should have helped the government, we should have created a better government. Regime change. America's done regime changes across the world. Why not do a good one over here, right? We have a democratic, sort of a non-corrupt government that pays their dues. Pressure them to say, pay your soldiers, treat them well. If not, we're gonna pull out and you can deal with the Taliban. You should have pressured them to do that, but you didn't. You just kept giving them arms, but mishandling it completely, right? You gotta do more than that. They weren't being supplied properly. The local government completely, Afghanistan government, and the more local governments, completely mishandled it. You should have pressured them to be better. You should have used the threat of, we're gonna pull out if you don't fix your shit. Oh, you didn't? Well, we're gonna pull out. But no, you just pulled out, and you didn't pressure them to get better as a government. You never addressed the systemic corruption. So now the army's falling apart, and now Taliban rule Afghanistan, basically. Women's rights are going to be completely bad. All these women who've been educated, who've been getting educated over the years that the US has been there, now their education's gone. Their rights are gone. The bodily autonomy is gone. Men who wanted not to be, you know, who didn't want beards, now going to have to grow beards. That might seem a small thing, but it's part of a larger problem. Now they also don't have freedom. So many people's freedoms are gone. Human rights abuses are going to be rampant. And what did America achieve? Nothing. Absolutely nothing achieved there. So this is a complete mess and a complete failure, and the way we exited was also terrible. This is just a horrible situation. I don't think anyone should get any credit for doing anything here. Like, I don't know. I think it's really bad. I don't want people to go overseas and die. I get it. I don't want that either. But the American government, it's not the soldiers' fault at all. This is the American government's fault for not handling this properly and addressing the correct issues. So I'm glad that soldiers won't die anymore, but I'm also very unhappy that we have not achieved anything, and all the soldiers who have died and who are traumatized from Afghanistan have got no reward. Like, at least if it would have been for a greater good, a sacrifice, then maybe it wouldn't be as bad. It would still be bad. I don't want people to have PTSD or any problems or to die or to be maimed. But now it's for nothing. I don't know how they're gonna feel. It's terrible. Just terrible. Alright, if you all enjoyed that video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you can be notified when I'm going to be posting, whenever I post. And follow me on Twitch and Twitter to see my thoughts and to see me live. Alright, see you all in the next video.